2.5 years have passed since the conclusion of our last chapter. Baru and Tenir'ha have both just turned 12 years old at the advent of the wet season. No longer are our twins pioneers of their respective homes in the southern steppes and Titan gardens. They are veterans of the slaughter. Up north, the first monsoon has come, and the Titan gardens are teeming with hatchling dinosaurs and lush undergrowth. Tenir'ha is just under 2 tons and is 8 meters from snout to the tip of her feathered tail. In the south, winter has recently conceded to spring, and the fields are lush. This has been a good year to Tenir'ha, but even better for Baru. He is also 8 meters long, but weighs in at 2 tons and 200 kilos. Thanks to a tremendous abundance of game, he's bulked up. They both look fairly robust, but that's about to change. The next 5 years are going to be of astonishing demand. These are the years in which they build their adult skeleton. They will be ravenous and unforgiving. They can endure harsh times in its aftermath with little consequence, but for now, every calorie they take increases their future size and chances. To make matters worse, both have reached maturity as hormones spike in anticipation of this growth. This rush of hormones technically makes them mature and capable of mating, but it's extremely rare for this capacity to even manifest in more than a fleeting interest in another Zentaur, and females almost never have the surplus to produce even a single egg, much less a clutch. Indeed, it makes them quite aggressive to other adults of their kind. Tenir'ha still lives near her elder sister Shiraxa, but they rarely sleep together and hunt alone. Shiraxa was tolerant of her little sister when she was immature, but the past few months, as she has begun to stink of puberty, Shiraxa's tolerance of her sister wears ever thin. They even came to blows over a carcass, which they used to amiably share as long as Tenir'ha understood her sister's meals came first. Shiraxa is nearing the end of her growth spurt. She's reached an impressive 12 meters in length and 6 tons of mass. She's still growing and will continue to do so over the next decade, but soon she will reach skeletal maturity and the demand won't be nearly as high. She's not yet at this plateau though, so can't spare anything for her sister. Now that Tenir'ha needs her own surplus, the two have little benefit of staying close. Tenir'ha mostly hunts Trocatul and Runendrake, while Shiraxa tackles the more robust Thescelosaurs and Baraphont in their habitat. This partitioning of favored game allows them to share territory, but Tenir'ha can only tolerate her elder sister displacing her from so many kills before she has to hunt further and further away. Within the next few years, Shiraxa will have to relocate. This is very good hunting grounds here in the lowland Titan Gardens, but if she is to mate and nest, she will need to find some place that is easier to defend. This is such ideal hunting ground for subadult Zentaur because it has abundance of game, but no elevated terrain for an ideal nest site, nor natural defenses to protect and fortify. There's a reason no adults have claimed this territory. No adult Zentaur is great for the young, but it's not like this has been miraculously overlooked by other adults. If Shiraxa were to nest here, it's unlikely her eggs would last a week. Cockatrice, hyenas, homotherium, boar, and any number of small predators would feast on her first hunt away from the nest. She must find a place that she can defend, and all ideal locations are in the nearby river valleys feeding into this vast forest. All valleys claimed by larger, more dominant females. She will either have to retreat south to the basins and hollers whence she was born, or wait to nest until she's large enough to challenge one of the resident dominant females. The closest dominant female is Heshekrata. At 15 tons, this oversized queen came from the north and is, of course, far beyond what Shiraxa, almost a third her size, is up for challenging. However, some of the other territories are claimed by females between 7 and 9 tons. These are more viable if Shiraxa spends another year or two growing. She doesn't make the conscious decision to wait, but it seems to be what her body has decided. She would need to leave soon if she were going to claim a territory and settle in time to lay eggs in 6 to 7 months. That's how long her body would need to prepare. Instead, she remains in the lowland gardens, foregoing another year of nesting to focus on further growth. That said, she's not without her interest in the local mature males. Male Zentaur do not need to establish territory. They often do defend regions with ample game and don't share with other males, but it's generally a more flexible arrangement than female territory. After all, males are the ones who wander to find mates hundreds of miles from their territory. If they want to mate, they can't be too territorial. However, the mating season has passed. Most males worth flirting with have long since returned home. Aratu is a local male. He was born in the coastal forests to the north, but has come to the gardens to grow, same as Tenir'ha and Shiraxa. His dark skin and coloration is not a case of melanism, just a fairly common trait in northern Zentaur. While Zentaur are generally recognized as a single species, in no small part because both sexes, and males especially, disperse quite far, ranging from equatorial to temperate climates, contribute to a considerable variation in their appearance. Northern Zentaur, for example, tend to have fairly sparse feathers, sometimes to the point of effective absence, and are often darker to compensate for having less feathers to shade their backs from the sun. Aratu has a healthy coat of feathers, but it's fairly localized to his upper body. A year older than Shiraxa, he's been periodically dancing for her for several years now. He's still a bit young to be a viable mate, but he's at least old enough to take her interest now. Zentaur normally only have a few weeks of courtship, but this years-long crush isn't uncommon amongst younger individuals. If nothing else, it affords good practice for both of them to refine the steps and notes of future courtship. Tenir'ha ignores this flirtation, instead focusing on her hunt. This aim carries her further and further from Shiraxa. With the abundance of the wet season and a lot of game enjoying the boom in foliage, there's still plenty for her to hunt now. In the south, Baru also enjoys this time of plenty. Seasons here in the southern steppes are fairly mild. Yes, the fields and forests only get a fraction of the rains his sister enjoys up north, but the dry season still has plenty of grass and spring-fed rivers. His favorite prey is moose. These deer are very abundant in the forests within the river valleys flanking the vast pasture. Boar and red stags are becoming increasingly difficult to catch as he gets bigger. He has good luck out on the steppes. Caribou are too fast and often not worth the effort, but he can match horses for speed, and Bérafont and rhinos are generally reliable targets as well now that he matches their weight. Large male Bérafont are generally too large, but he's gotten quite good at approaching downwind and striking at a calf or cow, then retreating before the bull can retaliate. Overall, he has free range over the staggering abundance of potential game. The other predators with whom he competes are either seasonal, like the occasional titangrow, omnivorous, like the bear sloth, or far too small to be considered competition. The largest lions are, at 600 kilos, something he could still be slain by in an ambush, but for the past few years, even his slumber has been secure. Tonbrou is by his side. This enormous Zentaur has only mated once in the past 3 years. Baru remained when he made the trek north, from which Tonbrou returned about 5 months ago. This journey was extremely taxing, and he was emaciated upon return. Scavenging Baru's kills these past few months has nursed him back to a healthy weight, but he will never again attempt the crossing. Tonbrou is now almost 50 years old. For his species, he's venerable. Most Zentaur slow down in their late 30s or early 40s. Unlike Steraconichine megaraptorans, which grow slow and can often live well into their 60s, robust monarchs average far shorter lifespans. Decades of punishment grappling large game catches up to them all. Arthritis assaults the joints. Old injuries take their toll. Eventually, slowing down leads to slipping up. Then they must turn to scavenging. They lack the speed to catch small game, and large game are increasingly too dangerous. If they aren't killed in a hunt, they fall to starvation or a competing Zentaur. Tonbrou has been spared these fates by his friendship with Baru. The pair have a fairly rare arrangement. Most mature males would have chased Baru away just as he hit puberty, but Tonbrou is slowing down just as Baru is speeding up. Baru likes company, so hasn't struck out on his own. That means the two continue to amiably cohabitate. Even with arthritis setting into a few joints of his right leg and left hand, Tonbrou is still able to hunt mammoths and Paleoloxodon now and then, which of course gives both him and Baru plenty to eat on these occasions. But the old man is only able to make a kill once every few weeks. Baru now brings in a vast majority of their meals. One late spring morning, Tonbrou strikes out to hunt mammoth. Baru accompanies him. Normally, Baru merely observes these hunts. He's learned a lot by observation. A few times he has made an attempt, but so far he has not managed a takedown of any mammoth. The mammoth herd is 10 miles from their normal territory. Hunting such large game often means that our pair have to travel far. It's often best to march inland for these hunts, as it means the scent of their territory isn't as overt. Now, Tonbrou leads them toward the herd from downwind. There are enough tree stands they are afforded a bit of cover. This is an especially massive herd of cows and calves, nearly 300 strong. Large herds like this are transient, migrating to keep on fresh pastures. Resident herds that Baru and Tonbrou often hunt are much smaller. This is an opportunity to hunt mammoths that aren't as used to Zentaur. However, they are connected to the infrasonic social network of mammoths, who communicate over many kilometers, where predators and resources are located. They know that there's danger here. A resident bachelor herd has even gathered to help escort them. However, they're keeping watch toward where the Zentaur usually are, not this far southwest. Tonbrou and Baru lie in wait in a stand of trees. The herd begins their march. Mammoth cows generally weigh between 3 and 5 tons. Bulls range between 5 and 7. An especially large bull, a tusker in his 60s, weighs in at 9 tons, not far from Tonbrou. He is the leader of this bachelor herd and especially vigilant. He doesn't see or smell our Zentaur, but he knows the danger of trees and is keeping an eye on them all the same. The matriarch of the herd, its leader, is in regular correspondence with him to ensure the flank is covered. The tusker even stops not far from our pair of Zentaur, standing watch as the herd moves past. Tonbrou has faced this old bull before. He is cautious. Perhaps he wants to wait until this tusker isn't so close. Baru comes to a different conclusion. Move away from the tusker. He jogs down the forest toward the rear of the herd. There's a pair of bulls here, but they're both younger, 5 tons each. More than twice his size, but he's much faster and more nimble. He seems to conclude he has a chance. Just as he's about to charge, chorus and commotion ahead draw the attention of the herd. Tonbrou is charging the tusker. The 2 younger bulls rush to his defense. This leaves an opening in the ranks for the cows further north, but Baru instead rushes after the bulls. The cows might be a bit smaller, but he's seen cows coordinate and drive off even tonbrü twice their size. After all, the largest cows aren't much smaller than these bulls, so perhaps the decision he's making is warranted. Also, the two bulls are entirely focused on supporting their mentor. They don't see the 2-ton theropods sprinting close to close the distance behind them. Instead, before they've even detected him, despite the warnings of the herd behind them, he lunges up and bites the back of the mammoth's neck. Baru quickly hoists himself up and embraces over the shoulder, punching his claws into the mammoth's neck. He's not quite big enough to reach the windpipe in this position, but it's still a painful injury. The mammoth screams, turning about and trying to throw him. His other companion turns to offer support to his fellow young bull instead of the old tusker. Baru kicks forward, scratching the mammoth's leg with his long foot claws. These claws are worn to blunt hooves given how much Baru runs, but it's still painful and the force behind them is substantial. After several kicks, the mammoth loses its stability and Baru lurches to the left. He takes the proboscidean to the ground. Thankfully, the fall was such that the other mammoth is now on the other side of his companion as Baru. Baru withdraws his claws and retreats as the mammoth rounds about, roaring at the young theropod. At first, it seemed another failed attempt by Baru. Tonbrü also falls back. Though the old mammoth's tusks are impressive, they're not particularly effective weapons. Intimidating to be sure, but it's the great mass of this mammoth that worries Tonbrü, and he decides it's presently not worth the risk. Not with all the mammoths around them. The two theropods retreat to the forest with seemingly nothing to show for their assault. However, by luck, Baru managed to cut a major artery in the neck of his opponent with his claw. Not the efficient windpipe execution he's seen Tonbrü perform, now over 100 times, but the blood loss is significant enough that the mammoth is only able to stand with great assistance, and soon he collapses. It may not be a first kill to take any great lessons from, but it's the beginning of what will one day become Baru's specialization, and a key in achieving the size and might of his mentor. We are now well into the dry season. Our twins have each grown nearly 1 meter and a ton in these times of plenty. For the herbivores, the good times have passed, and up in the Titan gardens, tensions are high. Large thescelosaurs, titans, and big mammals have come here after bulking up in the basin to the south, so there's a lot of mouths to feed and not a lot to go around. For the carnivores, this competition means opportunity. Shiraxa and Tenir'ha have joined a few other young adult Zentaur, 7 in total. These social hunts are rare, but so many big animals in the area means that it's often worth some cooperation. This is hardly what one might call a pack, just a bunch of predators mobbing the same prey. Indeed, it is often only 1 or 2 Zentaur actually putting in the killing effort. Aratu, Shiraxa's companion, is at the front of this congregation. Like Baru favoring moose because he grew up targeting deer, Aratu grew up with a preference for common drake and now sets his sights on a group of kotar. Normally, Shiraxa and Tenir'ha would never dare approach such dangerous game. Shiraxa much prefers kasktar, which lack sharp plates on their tails and the size of male kotar. However, Aratu approaches from downwind with confidence that inspires the rest to follow. Before he can advance upon one of the cows, an intruder bellows from further upwind. Cresting over the hill is a massive sloth, a hukulgor. The sloth is 10 tons. Not the largest boar of his kind, but still larger than the 8-ton thescelosaur that charges him. Kotar drakes are not intelligent. Indeed, they are among Kaimere's least intelligent dinosaurs, even surpassed in some respects by the sauropods and ankylosaurs. Even so, the book Kotor seems to remember that sloths are dangerous. While they generally leave adults alone, myelodont sloths sometimes kill and eat young thescelosaurs. Then again, perhaps this is just an ornery animal reacting to another large presence near his herd. At his approach, the sloth stands on its columnar hind legs. The Kotor opens its jaws. While it may lack the gripping and tearing teeth of a Zentaur, this herbivore still has a formidable beak, not to mention many claws and spurs on its forearms to employ after a bite. Before this bite can land, however, the sloth catches his opponent with a smack of his own clawed hand. Sloths may not be quick, but their slow-twitch muscles pack astonishing strength. He's not able to time the slap so claws maximize the damage, but his buffet still knocks the drake off course. The sloth and drake engage in a grapple. The sloth's superior height is an advantage, and it scores numerous scraping bites with its long tusks. The thescelosaur, in turn, bites several places. Worst is when it presses its chest against the sloth, and the two wrestle in an embrace. The Kotor manages to drag its spurs and clawed hands along the sloth's chest and belly. Hukogor have thick, flexible skin on their torsos to repel this sort of attack from other sloths. It's a shockingly bloody fight, but thankfully for both combatants, neither is actually armed well to kill. Their respective injuries are no doubt very painful, but neither scores anything close to a lethal blow. Once they've both established their respective might, the pair back away from one another, breathing heavy in exhaustion. While they dueled, Aratu snuck around and executed a 2-ton subadult member of the herd. It was only when the other Zentaur converged to aid that the herd of Kotor noticed. The Kotor bull leaves his opponent and charges the Zentaur. He's slow and tired even at full charge, giving Aratu time to take the young Kotor in his arms and retreat with the carcass to the woods. A few days later, we find this cohort of Zentaur trailing the Hukogor. The mighty sloth is unwell. Several of his injuries took infection. Nothing his formidable immune system can't eventually shrug off, but for the moment, he's in a vulnerable state. He's lounging in a river to keep cool. The Zentaur approach from downwind. However, since the Hukogor is facing that direction, he spots them before they can get too close. The sloth stands tall, spreading his arms in an imposing display. The Zentaur close in. Aratu steps into the water up to his ankles. It's 2 meters at its deepest where the Hukogor is lounging, and Aratu is likely hoping the sloth will come to him a bit further out. However, the sloth remains. He's no tactician, but he knows Zentaur are generally wary of deeper water. He, on the other hand, is surprisingly proficient in this setting. He can hold his breath much longer and keep stable. If Aratu comes to him now, it will likely not go well for the Zentaur. The sloth bellows out to our Zentaur. Aratu and Shiraxa meet his vocal challenge. Eventually, the excitement wanes, and the theropods sit along the southern banks whence they came. Several hours of this stalemate go by. The north shore is a fairly steep incline. The river is more shallow both up and downstream. The sloth can either meet the predators where it grows shallow, face them on shore, or continue to wait in the center of this much deeper stretch. It quickly becomes evident that he is quite comfortable with the latter. At his size, he has plenty of reserves. Yes, he should eat, and it will help regain his strength, but he can go days without eating if he must. Aratu and the rest aren't prepared to do so. Also, he sees much better at night than Zentaur, and indeed, that's when he does most of his foraging. He seems perfectly content to wait them out. As the afternoon carries on, several members of the cohort wander off. Soon, it is just Tenir'ha, Shiraxa, and Aratu. As night approaches, Tenir'ha also gives up. The other two remain, but she meanders off west, where she knows Trocatul often congregate in the lake a few kilometers downstream. However, she's not yet out of sight when she spots an enormous silhouette of a giant watching her sister and Aratu. Heshekrata, the great queen of these lands, must have smelled the injured sloth from down by the lake. Her territory is quite far off. Perhaps there is not much game by her valley, forcing her to wander. Then again, Tenir'ha notices it's not the sloth the giant Zentaur is looking at. It's Shiraxa. Zentaur do not generally kill others of their kind. It happens, of course. Anytime there's a violent confrontation, things can get ugly. However, there's also a lot of competition in this garden. Having adult Zentaur patrolling the territory of other adults isn't ideal. Well and good when it's potential mates passing through, but Shiraxa is an adult without a territory, taking from the resident queens. Zentaur don't usually look to kill, but this simply will not stand. This hunt is not for prey. It is to eliminate competition. Tenir'ha lets out a shrill warning cry. It's driven by fear, but possibly alarm. Heshekrata turns her ire toward Tenir'ha. Though Tenir'ha is now 3 tons, large enough that she's not well able to flee well in the dense vegetation here near the river. She backs up into the water as the giant approaches. Heshekrata is almost 15 tons, even at her leanest seasonal weight. Her size is such that the foliage bends and breaks to her advance. Tenir'ha takes off upriver just as the enormous queen erupts through the foliage. While Tenir'ha is much more agile, Heshekrata is surprisingly quick despite looking ponderous. Each of her strides covers a lot of ground. The sloth and Aratu both flee at their approach, the Hukogor upriver, and Aratu into the woods. Shiraxa, on the other hand, flexes her coat and rushes to her sister's aid. Tenir'ha races past her sister, carrying on after Aratu into the woods. With Heshekrata almost at her tail, there's barely a moment before Heshekrata and Shiraxa meet. Thankfully, the audacity of Shiraxa seems to buy a stall from the Great Queen's charge. She slows, glaring down. Shiraxa weighs 7 tons, just under half of her opponent's mass. Yet she stands, snarling and snapping furiously. For all her ferocity, the match looks hopeless. This is precisely what Heshekrata wanted, for a chance to eliminate a competing nomad. Rather than having to chase, Shiraxa has come to her. Shiraxa steps back, evading the first bite, but the Great Queen presses the attack. Her next strike is true, catching Shiraxa's upper jaw. Thankfully, it's just the edge of the Queen's maw, and her fangs haven't had a chance to penetrate. Even this nip of sorts is strong enough that Heshekrata is able to shake and turn Shiraxa about. If the Queen can get a better bite, she may not even need to employ her arms, as her jaws pack sufficient strength to... Aratu sprints from the forest. He lands hard with his chest against her side, turning his head and biting the back of Heshekrata. He sinks both clawed hands into the meat of her side. Though he fails to make purchase due to her movement, his claws do score several painful lacerations. Just as Heshekrata turns to bite him, Shiraxa snaps at the queen's lower jaw. It doesn't keep hold, but it slows the bite such that Aratu can back away. When Heshekrata turns back on Shiraxa, Aratu nips her arm. This teamwork carries on for several exchanges, and Heshekrata is unable to score a meaningful blow to either opponent. Perhaps inspired by this turning of the tides, Tenir'ha also rushes in, biting the bulging lump of muscle connecting leg to tail. Aratu bites the queen's jowls, pulling her head down. Rather than pull away, Heshekrata turns her head and bites down at the top of his. Finally, she has scored a good hit. As her jaws clench, he releases his bite, slashing and clawing at her face with his left hand. She cudgels with her right, driving both claws to the base of his neck. As Aratu desperately kicks at Heshekrata, the queen repositions her jaws so her next bite engulfs the top of his head, a fang penetrating his eye. Rather than see it through, Heshekrata disengages and turns on Shiraxa, just as the young Zentaur bites the back of her neck. Heshekrata bites down toward Shiraxa's leg. One claw is still embedded in Aratu's neck, so she doesn't manage to make contact, but it's enough that Shiraxa hops back. Once she finally manages to withdraw her claw, Aratu slumps into the water. He's struggling and keeping his head above the surface, but he's out of the fight. Shiraxa stands down, falling back to shore. Tenir'ha bites once more at the base of Heshekrata's tail, distracting the queen long enough for Shiraxa to put further distance between herself and Heshekrata. For a moment, stillness takes over the river. Shiraxa is now a dozen meters away, avoiding eye contact with the queen. Tenir'ha has fully retreated to shore, and Aratu is gasping for air at Heshekrata's feet. The queen is breathing slow. This is certainly not the fight she was anticipating. She does not attempt to meet Shiraxa's gaze. Aratu begins to take in water as he's gasping for breath. He's lost a lot of blood from the claws in his neck, and it's getting harder and harder to hold his head up above the surface. His struggles seem to break the stalemate, and Heshekrata plants a massive foot on his chest. She then bites down on the muscles of his leg and tail, securing a hold with her fangs and tearing the muscle out. She then glares at Shiraxa, who quickly retreats. To the south, winter has set in. The changes in the seasons aren't as drastic here. Generally speaking, there's not a whole lot of seasonal migration, just grazers moving about so as not to deplete a given region. Large herds, like mammoths and bison especially, have to move more often in winter, as the grass doesn't recover as quickly in these months. The seasons don't bring with them dramatic swings in temperature. Baru still hunts a lot of moose and Barafont, but mammoths are increasingly common for him to target. Normally, wind blows south here if it blows at all. Much of this habitat is along the 30-degree latitude, a convergence of the Hadley and Ferrell circulation cells. A high-pressure zone that generally has minimal winds, hence this latitude being called some variation of the dead winds in the language of Chimerans. When a storm does come, it's usually in the form of whatever deflated remains of a hurricane was able to make it over the mountains, typically manifesting as a mild rain. However, weather is not restricted to rigid patterns, and sometimes the wind changes course, either from altering pressures or temperatures. As many animals are, Tonbru is aware of these changes and what they mean after having spent so much time here in the south, and has taken Baru deeper inland into the forest. This evening, a warm front passing from the west shifted air pressure, drawing in a storm from the south and bringing to these shores a fairly rare phenomenon: a snowstorm. Overnight, 1/2 meter of snow fell onto their territory, and more falls throughout the morning. In total, 130 centimeters of snow covers the landscape as Baru and Tonbrou get up to hunt. Baru is cautious, but Tonbrou seems excited. The old Zentaur jogs through the trees. He buries his face in it, biting at snowbanks and kicking about. Baru follows, taking wary steps through this strange, cold substance. Perhaps out of insecurity in this new phenomenon, Baru stays very close to his mentor. Even stranger is when Tonbrou makes his way out to the pastures and uphill. Once at the top of a fairly mild slope, he hunkers down onto his belly and slides forward. It requires a bit of aid of kicks and turns, and eventually he rolls over onto his back. Tonbrou's first winter here in the south, a similar storm passed through. He and his two brothers discovered this form of play. He can't glide across the packed snow like he used to, but still finds joy in the attempt all the same. Baru eventually joins him. Together they spend the rest of the afternoon shoving their way through snow and gliding down hills. It is the end of the wet season, a year later. Tenir'ha has not seen Shiraxa for several weeks. She hunts and has lived alone. Normally, she hunted alone before, but she could eat better with Shiraxa since they each balanced out one another's success. Now, she only eats when she makes a kill. This wet season was impoverished. She had to travel far to find good food. However, she still makes ends meet, just hasn't grown as much as perhaps she should. Shiraxa's absence has been for good reason. She has noticed an opportunity. In one of the valleys feeding into the gardens, the dominant female Jadosa has been weakened by an infection. While hunting Kotar, she received a hard injury to her jaws and neck. She hasn't eaten a full meal in weeks, and has not laid eggs this year as a consequence. Shiraxa has positioned herself at the mouth of this valley. She's been marking the borders of this resident's territory. This is not a challenge to the resident so much as a warning to other females who might hope to challenge her claim. Shiraxa is 18.5 years old. Waiting, rather than trying to establish a territory earlier, has proven worthwhile. She has been eating well, and weighs just under 8 tons. Over a ton lighter than the pale-feathered rival she's preparing to challenge, but their respective situations have changed the convention of mass being an overwhelming factor in Zentaur dominance. Finally, after a few weeks of waiting, Shiraxa makes her move. She advances into the valley, bellowing out and dancing along the river. The old queen rises to meet the challenge. Normally, Zentaur settle their differences with display. That's how Jadosa has sent off hundreds of challengers since claiming this territory. Sometimes it comes to blows, in these instances she's won dozens of battles, both in territory and generally throughout her 36 years. Even with her wounds, she has experience and size in her favor, and isn't about to bow out now. Perhaps unusual for a Zentaur, she doesn't beat the dance. Perhaps in her eyes, there's no point. Shiraxa knows she's injured. A dance proves nothing. The old queen simply advances, eyes locked on Shiraxa's throat. Though Shiraxa initiates another dance and song, she seems to quickly understand that Jadosa has elected to skip the formalities. Works for her. Shiraxa rushes to meet the challenge. It might be wise to evade the first clash, as her opponent now marching downhill has momentum on her side, but these are tactics beyond the comprehension of a Zentaur's mind. Instead, Shiraxa goes to bite Jadosa's snout and initiate a grapple. Rather than abide this convention, Jadosa lowers her head. Shiraxa scores a bite to the top of her opponent's snout, but this is where Zentaur are most heavily armored, and the larger Zentaur's momentum continues, Shiraxa fails to gain purchase. Instead, she is all but shoved aside as the twist of Jadosa's head dislodges her loose bite, and the queen's jaws clamp onto Shiraxa's throat. Shiraxa cries out as the queen pulls back, dragging her along the dry riverbed. One of Jadosa's fangs has pierced deep. As she jerks back, her front teeth shred the skin anchoring Shiraxa's brilliant white ruff. Unfortunately for the queen, her jaw strength is compromised by her injury. She struggles to clamp down with sufficient force to crush her opponent's windpipe. A swift finish is what she needed, and with this failure, the tides suddenly turn. Shiraxa is now well positioned to strike with her hands. Face biting is the reflex for good reason. It's a good test of reaction and strength while minimizing potentially lethal encounters. Twice, Shiraxa slaps her hand against Jadosa's injured neck. The queen refuses to let go, tearing a long wound with her right fang. Shiraxa's third slap ends the grip of her jaws, piercing deep where jaw meets throat. This finally loosens the bite of her opponent. As Shiraxa dislodges her claws, she feels the bite fail. Her next slap sends Jadosa off her entirely. The old queen keeps her footing, but Shiraxa bites down, pushing her to the ground. Jadosa shakes her off before she can get a secure bite, and backs away. In their clash, Shiraxa now ended up with a high ground. Now, Jadosa flexes her feathers, spreads her arms, and stands tall. However, this is not in challenge. She is not looking toward Shiraxa, indeed staring down and aside. She takes a step back. She's conceding, but merely running could incite a chase. Shiraxa also avoids eye contact. She's letting her go. There's no triumphant roar. Indeed, one could be forgiven for thinking this was inconsequential, as the two are adamantly avoiding looking at one another. Once Jadosa has fallen back several paces, her feathers relax. She turns and retreats downriver. It is too late in the season for Shiraxa to attract a mate and nest, but now she has time to become familiar with this new territory. Her territory. Change comes to the south as well. As Baru has grown, now weighing 5 tons, Tonbru has gotten fairly lean, now weighing 9 tons compared to the 10 he was when he and Baru met. A stranger has come to Baru and Tonbru's territory. This is Odaparu. At 19 years old, he's a mature male near his prime, having just made the journey across the mountain pass to the east. There wasn't much game, so he followed the scent of his own kind here. He has lingered near the pair for several days, assessing local game and evaluating the competition. At 7.5 tons, he's sufficiently smaller than Tonbru that he's hesitant to attack the old bull directly. However, like Shiraxa, he senses weakness in the larger rival, and seems to think it's worth remaining. This is a bountiful region. Lots of mammoths in the grasslands and elephants in the nearby forests, plenty of Barafont between. While he may be wary of Tonbru, he has no such reservations for Baru. Baru may be big for his age, and not much smaller than Odaparu in terms of linear dimensions. He still has the fairly narrow juvenile frame and is quite gangly. When the older, robust male approached him after Baru made a kill, Baru quickly stands down. Odaparu does not have much experience killing mammoths. He's not a veteran of the south, he just came here after another male used the same pass then went east. However, he is a veteran of stealing kills from younger Zentaur. There aren't females around driving his aggression, so attacking Baru isn't worth the effort. After all, Why kill what could become an avenue for plenty of easy meals? Tonbru approaches from the edge of the forest. He's larger than Odaparu, though his movement is stiff, measured. He growls, but it's more of a tired grumble than anything particularly intimidating. Odaparu knows he's not up for two opponents. He falls back as Tonbru closes in. This plays out twice more in the coming days. Baru makes a kill, Odaparu displaces him, then Tonbru sees the intruder off. Finally, young Baru seems to decide he's done being pushed around. He snaps and hisses, but the bigger male ignores him, instead indulging in the choice portions of Baru's kill. It's only when Baru bites the tip of his feathered tail that Odaparu actually takes effort against the young male. Baru's lighter frame affords him far greater speed to retreat, but that only briefly irritates Odaparu before he returns to his feast. Twice more Baru harasses him, but Odaparu ignores him. Tonbru doesn't come this time, and Odaparu settles down by the carcass, so Baru will get no shares, rather than the third place he's taken the past few days. When he makes his next kill a few days later, Odaparu is waiting in a nearby tree stand and approaches before the mammoth has even stopped breathing. As he approaches, Baru charges the larger male. Right away, they clash. Odaparu meets his face bite, and the two tussle and shove. Odaparu's vastly superior strength affords clear and quick advantage. He snaps onto Baru's upper jaw, his fang piercing deep and scraping down the bone on his left maxillary pad. He then bites again, this time getting a firm hold. A roar behind that makes Odaparu shake and release his younger opponent. He rounds on Tonbru as the older male bellows his challenge. Odaparu is not looking for a fight, just an easy meal to recover from his long journey over the mountains. He tries to back away, but he finds himself trapped between two opponents and a mammoth carcass. Though he tries to race between Baru and the dead mammoth, our young Megaraptoran bites the neck of his foe, his rage at this thief driving both fangs into Odaparu's neck, and his right claws pierce the base of his throat. Again, the greater strength of Odaparu prevails. This time, when he rounds on Baru, it is with lethal intent. He shoves his way out of the younger male's bite, then as Baru turns right to flee, the larger male secures a hold of his own on Baru's side, his left fang piercing into his back. His right hand slashes along Baru's thighs. These injuries aren't deep, but prompt a terrified cry all the same. Baru is trying to flee, but he's gotten the fight he wanted, and it's too late to retreat now. In this focused retaliation, it seems Odaparu forgot about the other Zentaur. Tonbru bites down on the back of Odaparu's neck. As he pulls back, he slams both clawed hands into Odaparu's side. Odaparu releases his hold on Baru and shoves back. Now, it is he who is at a disadvantage for mass and is unable to push his way free. Tonbru's left hand has such arthritis that it's little more than a cudgel, but his great hooks of his right hand are able to pierce, and one slides between his enemy's ribs, punching through hide, muscle, and into organs. The finger then clenches, tearing further. All the while, Tonbru is shaking his head, letting his teeth rend flesh and feather. His opponent frees his neck, sustaining terrible injury in the process. Odaparu may be grappled, but he's not helpless. He manages to turn enough that he can bite, and his jaws clamp down on Tonbru's ankle. Rather than fall, Tonbru disengages. Odaparu staggers back, putting distance between himself and the old bull. Tonbru is limping, but the great bird keeps his gaze fixed on the thief. Baru has also collected himself, hissing low at Odaparu. After a few steps back, Odaparu turns and marches south. Tonbru's ankle isn't broken, but a severe fracture runs along his central metatarsal. Both claw-bearing fingers of his good hand are broken from the swift and twisting disengagement. He eases to sit. Baru's injuries look more severe, but they are thankfully superficial. Baru waits for Tonbru to feed, but the old male remains seated. Finally, Baru stands and enjoys the choice portions. He again looks back at Tonbru. If the old male is hungry, he doesn't show it. As Baru is injured and feeling vulnerable, he's wary to sit too close to Tonbru, but they do sleep only a few meters apart. At some point in the night, Tonbru does slump down to fully rest on his side, which Baru leans into for comfort. With a rising sun, Baru awakens. Tonbru does not. He did not perish just from his injuries. None were severe enough to end the old veteran if he were in good condition. Perhaps his health and age were merely at a point where anything might be his undoing. The exertion of the fight may have been all he could handle. Baru remains by his side for the rest of the day. The combined carcass of Mammoth and Zentaur have drawn a bit of a scavenger audience, but not as much as one might expect. As the winds shift, Baru smells a possible explanation. He smells another dead Zentaur not far south. If he were to stand, he could likely see the corpse of Odaparu a few kilometers away. Unlike Tonbru, this bull did sustain lethal injury. Not only did Baru's claws pierce his liver, Baru's claw penetrated his throat, and the back of his neck was torn open and severely shaken. These combined injuries and shock appear to have taken their toll. He was helpless as hyenas, bobcats, and lions descended upon him in the night, all furiously taking their shots at the broken dragon from the north until he finally breathed his last. The shifting winds that enable this scent to be brought up the steps to Baru is prelude to strange weather. Another snowstorm. This is not as substantial as Baru's first snow. This time it's barely enough to stick, though it does come through fast. Soon, a white powder covers the grassland. Baru feeds again on the now cold carcass of the mammoth. Once he's had his fill, he turns west and starts walking. A far more bountiful wet season comes to a close. Tenir'ha has made up much of her deficit, now weighing 5 tons. She's 11.5 meters long, same length her mother reached at skeletal maturity. She hears the bellow of titans. Tenir'ha is, like many other predators, drawn to their songs. All the killers who live near titans know that a brawl like this often ends with opportunity of the opponent slain. An opportunity like this can feed everyone for weeks. Eventually, after 3 days of song, Shah Kanaru arrives at the base of the hill. The resident bull is waiting for him. Both have already had time to inflate their sacks along their necks and faces, resembling a formidable hood. There is only a brief visual intimidation. Shah Kanaru notes that the left side of his rival's hood is barely inflated. His auditory assessment that this bull had some sort of sinus infection seems to be justified. Perhaps the result of an injury with another bull during this mating season. Shah Kanaru bellows, adding the deflation of his hood to the dissonant choir, as it seems 100 eldritch voices contribute to this horrid scream. His rival echoes the call, but he starts later and ends sooner on account of his limited reserves. Flush with confidence, Shakanaru advances. The pair circle one another. They assess each other's strides. Because keratoderms are so lightly built, they can move with surprising deftness. Shakanaru is especially light on his feet. The osteoderms of his hip, neck, and tail are all sharp and healthy. His rival's old enough that most of his are worn or subdermal. Blood rushes to their necks and faces. They can see in the ultraviolet spectrum, so are able to detect more of a colorful display than we might discern. We also cannot hear most of the sounds they make, as they're too deep for our ears to hear, but to them, this conversation seems to increase Shakanaru's certainty. Finally, when it's clear the older male isn't just gonna back down, Shakanaru decides it's time for battle. There's even a skip in his step as he closes the distance. Shakanaru's opponent rears up on his hindquarters. Our keratoderm obliges the request, even building up enough momentum to rise up and take a few steps on his back legs before the collision. Right away, the superior mass of his opponent proves its worth. He doesn't budge. Indeed, he presses forward, pushing our bull back a step. The dominant bull strikes forward, beating Shakanaru with his forearm. He's missing a thumb claw on his right arm, having left it in the side of a rival, but his arm still acts as a morning star, bristling with ample studded spikes of horn. Shakanaru bites at the throat of his taller opponent, but this thick elastic hide is adapted to take such punishment, aided by several decades of scarring. Shakanaru has greater athletic capabilities and keeps his footing as he turns aside. He catches a swing of his opponent's arm to the back of the neck before the older bull lands in a crouch. He may have an infection, but he's proving he didn't keep the cows around on false promises. As the bull continues forward, he kicks a leg back, flexing his tail muscles and swinging his horn-studded tail at Shakanaru's right flank as the younger bull turns about. Their tail weaponry may not be specialized as a Majinuk's for damage, but the impact is still painful and will leave a horrid bruise. Shakanaru rushes back into the brawl. He has closed the distance before his rival has the chance to stand, and Shakanaru rears up. His left arm lands hard on the back of his opponent's neck at the base, preventing him from standing further. Then he bites at his rival's face before striking the base of his throat with his right arm. Rather than lean into this attack and try to reposition the grapple so he could rear up as well, the rival turns left, perhaps trying to disengage. This angle means Shakanaru can no longer strike with his right arm. To make matters worse, the larger rival tries to kick his foot forward. The long claws flex out, just barely missing Shakanaru's thick tail muscle. His next kick grazes, leaving a pair of shallow cuts. In response, Shakanaru lifts his own leg up and kicks hard. His claws punch deep into his rival's leg where it meets his belly. This skin is thinner than most Titan hide to allow the leg a bit of mobility. Once Shakanaru's claws are in, he leans into the wound, letting his claws rake a pair of deep gashes. The resident bull cries out in pain. Shakanaru's clawed foot is dislodged, and he leans into his opponent. The larger bull steps back, managing to evade the next kick. Once they continue a few paces, Shakanaru dismounts, stepping back once it's clear even with his victory. He's not one to such a degree that he can kill his foe here and now. The bull is beaten. For Shakanaru, that's enough. For those gathered who hope to have a tremendous meal right before their own nesting season, Shakanaru letting his opponent live is disappointing. However, before he gets far, one of those hopeful carnivores decides to take matters into her own hands. Hashekrata advances as the Titan makes his way through the forest. She comes in from the right. As he sees her, he tries to turn and present his tail, but his injury slows him enough that she's able to quickly close the space between. She's watched him close. She knows where he is weak. Her first bite is to the muscles connecting leg to tail. After securing a strong bite, she twists her head, managing to strain where the muscle connects to the leg. A few more bites later and she's crippled him, though he manages to still stand. She then circles around, making sure to give his tail a wide berth. They could still strike to the left with considerable force. She then digs into the muscle of his left leg, forcing him to ground. Rather than finish him, she begins to open his torso, digging for the liver. Once she finishes her prize and a lot of meat in her arms, Hashekrata leaves for her territory and the eggs she will soon lay. Tenir'ha and the rest converge upon this bounty as he slowly perishes in the garden he once ruled. Down south, Baru has been alone for a year. He is over 1,000 miles west of where he and Tonbru spent years past. Though his spirits are low in this solitude, having only his mouth to feed has done wonders for his growth. He weighs 6 tons and boasts a length of almost 13 meters, being well on his way to an enormous, fully mature adult form. Here in the West, there's generally the same game, with a few differences. It's even more arid here, with only a few scattered forests. Drenduga are quite rare, but mammoths are very abundant. They have become his staple. Wind now periodically comes from the west, perhaps driving him ever in that direction due to the scent of his favored prey and not wanting to alert them to his presence. He's gotten exceptional at the approach and execution. There's also Barafont, but he's now large and slowed enough that they can often evade him if he fails the initial ambush. Yes, he can often chase them to exhaustion, but it often comes at a frustration of many missed lunges before they're finally worn down. Other game like caribou, horses, and rose elk are still abundant, but at this age, catching them is a lot of work with little reward. Grappling mammoths is, at this point, simply easier. As the dry season sets in, even mammoths become scarce. He continues west for a time, but eventually circles back. There's no game here, save a few camels. Large enough to be a meal, but they are far too fast to catch and there's no cover here for an ambush. Baru resigns himself to this direction being a failure and sets his sights back east. Tenir'ha has just turned 17 and a half. She's reached the plateau of her growth and her skeletal maturity of 12 meters. She's claimed 6 tons to her seasonal peak weight. It is the end of the wet season. If she is to brood and nest this year, she needs to find a mate soon. Thankfully, she already has a territory. She's been in this holler for a few months now. It's a tributary to the same river passing through Shirax's valley and empties right at its base, likely how she was able to establish a territory so close to the gardens. The hills around them here don't connect to the highlands, merely a series of wrinkles in the garden crust, but afford natural defenses for them to reliably defend. Shiraxa has already bonded with a mate. At 9 tons and 13 meters, she's grown into a dominant female of her own right. He has remained with her for several weeks now. Tenir'ha calls out at the base of her own holler. After several days, she is approached by a young male with dark feathers. His scent is familiar. This is Hamatu, younger brother of Aratu. He and Tenir'ha are of similar size and the same age. Perhaps because he smells familiar, she is quickly receptive to his song. Like his older brother, Hamato is quite athletic in his dance steps. Soon, they begin to dance together. In the following days, Tenir'ha lays her first clutch of eggs. 3 in total. Not bad for her first year. 4 years go by. Tenir'ha has a fairly meager first few years, but by now she has several surviving chicks from each clutch. Having some of Shirax's young sometimes meander into her territory has helped protect her young from nest raiders, meaning that she's had better luck than most mothers her age. Though she and Shiraxa barely see each other, their territories do intersect, and they occasionally even hunt together in times of plenty. They even share a mate 2 years prior. It's an unusual arrangement, but not unheard of. Tenir'ha has just mated and laid her nest. Hamato returned to her this year, sharing their second clutch together. He has just departed, heading east. Their bond was early in the mating season. She's had plenty to eat and takes her time brooding. This will be her largest clutch yet. 8 eggs once she has laid her last. Once she's finished, she wanders forth to find a meal. As she's out patrolling, she picks up a scent she has not smelled in 12 years. She follows the scent to an enormous male Zentaur looming over the carcass of a freshly killed olifant. This Zentaur is 13.5 meters long. At just over 10 tons, despite losing weight over a long journey over the mountains, he's almost a third again larger than Tenir'ha. He's covered in scars, most notably a long cut along his snout that exposes his left fang. For a moment, he flexes a radiant coat of golden feathers and the fullest white ruff she's ever seen, though he calms when the wind shifts and carries her scent to him. Baru has made his first crossing north. He's come looking for a mate. He made the crossing east and has been meandering. Most females he's come across have already chosen a mate, and some like Tenir'ha have already laid their eggs. This may not be his year, but he's still searching for a few days longer before he returns to what he now considers home in the southern steppes. The twins circle one another. Baru has already had his fill, so is not as defensive as he might be a few moments prior. They bob their heads high and low, flexing and shaking their feathers as they go. Tenir'ha is the first to lean in. He bites her snout, but it's careful. She bites back, turning slightly. They then brush their sensitive maxillary pads together, emitting a low gurgle as they walk side by side. This reunion is brief. After another nudged exchanged, Baru carries on. He's not intentionally leaving her the carcass. He just needs to go find a potential mate soon, or he'll be out of luck for the year. However, this is still quite a gift to help her get back to full strength after laying her eggs. She enjoys a full meal, removes a leg, and returns to her holler. Baru wanders for another 2 days. He calls out in query, but doesn't hear any replies. Finally, just as he's preparing to leave the gardens, he hears a distant song. It takes him all afternoon to cross the gardens to the distant set of hills. He calls out to her a few times. He hears a masculine bellow as well. He won't be without competition. Though he's headed for the feminine song, it is one of the males he meets first. This is a northern male. At 12 meters and 6 tons, he's certainly an imposing predator, and since he's not made nearly as much of a treacherous journey, is at his prime weight. However, he deflates upon seeing Baru approach. He keeps his head low, and Baru walks past, barely acknowledging him. No sense in getting into a needless scrap. Instead, he saves his energy for a kill. He finds and brings down another olifant, this one a cow small enough that he can carry, and sets off toward his singer. Another kilometer ahead, he meets the siren at the base of her own holler. She matches his over 13-meter length and is a bit taller. She's lighter at 9 tons, but mostly that's because she's still a bit narrow. 2 years his junior, though this is her first year having claimed a territory. Surprising, perhaps, given her size, but she's just big for her age. This is Mirha, eldest surviving daughter of Heshek-Rata. Like her mother, Mirha is barely feathered. Perhaps this has put off some potential mates. Beru, however, doesn't seem to mind. He's not had the benefit of flirting companions in his youth. He instinctively knows a few steps and songs, but hasn't developed much complexity or identity. He sets down the 2-ton olifant between them, ruffles his feathers, and stands tall. She makes a few awkward steps of her own. She's still a bit gangly. They watch each other take a few steps here and there. Finally, his big finish is stepping back and nudging the olifant toward her. Rather than take any ceremonial bites, she digs in, freely indulging in the choice portions. After feeding, she leans forward. When he doesn't back away, she brushes her snout against his maxillary pad. They gently bite each other's snouts, then Mirha leads him into her holler. On his way back home a few weeks later, Beru passes near Tenir'ha and Shirax's territories. He encounters his twin out hunting. They are both hungry now, and only briefly bump snouts before going their separate ways. It has been a perilous journey, and there are many dangers ahead, but our twins have each grown into a formidable monarch. Each one of the great rulers of Kaimere.